Okay, so no major course announcements or changes today, other than just a reminder, we do have our exam 3 on Wednesday. And for that exam, another reminder is that you can have a cheat sheet, so it's a standard printer paper, the 11 by 8.5 piece. You can put anything you want on it. The only stipulation is it needs to be handwritten and just show it to the exam camera, front and back you can use, so show both sides to the camera when you log into the exam before you begin, and you're welcome to use scratch paper in addition to this as well. So some people might be more comfortable doing the calculations by hand. Handheld calculators are allowed. You can use a calculator on your computer. You just cannot use your phone as a calculator. But yeah, okay, why don't I share my screen then? And we can get started, and we'll go over both T12 today and T13, and that'll get us through all of the Cogbooks materials related to exam 3. All right. My screen showing up for Cogbooks, right? Okay, cool. So start off just talking about fluctuating age structure. So we've been talking a lot about population growth. We learned that some models are very simple, such as exponential and geometric growth and even logistic. But then they can get more complex with the logistic adding carrying capacity and the other life tables adding in different age structures. And we'll see further today differences in age structure with reproduction to look at how we get from one size population to the next, from one year to the next, how the population changes. So this first one just kind of shows a cool example of, fluctuating age structure. So what they did is they had an example where they surveyed these fish, but they captured them in nets. So they can only survey them from age 2 and beyond. So they can't really tell right away when you get a year with a really large growth. So what they saw was if we started in 1946, they kind of see, these 2-year-olds, there was a fair amount of them, but then also when they turned 3, they were a large percentage of that population. From they were 4 and 5 until they hit age 6, they started to decline, likely due to old age, and then started to die off in year 7 and 8. But it just shows that methods are important for how we're able to make predictions. So if we don't know what the size is for newborns or 1-year-olds, it can maybe throw off what our predictions would be for populations later in life. And then the point of this is we get into this modeling of age structure, and we're going to get into some of these matrix models. So they bring back up the geometric growth here. So we've seen this before. This is, rho, our net reproductive growth. This is generation time. We've seen all of these before. And what they're kind of getting at now is how we can use this information from a life table and put it in a matrix table and vice versa to find different, or to answer different questions about population growth. So it looks like a lot potentially for building a matrix model, and there are a fair amount of steps involved in it, but it's maybe hopefully not as complicated as it initially looked. So what the matrix model is really going to focus in is you're going to give some sort of life table that has, the age structure, the population sizes, your survival rates, your survivorship numbers, as well as your fecundity. And then you can transplant this or move this into what they call a matrix model. And to do that, what we're really interested in for the center of the matrix model is the fecundity. So the B of X values, those go on the top row all the way across. And then the survival rate numbers go one below, and then they kind of go on a diagonal. And then every other value in that matrix table is a 0. So given this table, we can fill in the entirety of this matrix table. So this top row, 0, 0, 2, 4.5, and 1. Those are our values over here in the fecundity column. So 0, 0, 2, 4.5, and 1. And again, survivorship, this column is what goes on the diagonal. So it's probably not a bad idea. I would, give a hint, maybe putting at least this side of the matrix model in your notes on the cheat sheet. For the exams, you don't have to memorize where the values go. You can kind of just look, and then you'll be able to replicate this for parts of the exam. And then it shows us how to calculate all the values within the matrix model according to their age structure. So we can do this for the first year, which will give us our value we can then use to calculate for our second year. So the full matrix table then is you have a column out here. This is what we're solving for. So this is time t plus 1. So the next time point. It could be a month later, it could be a year later, it could be 10 years later. Most of the examples use 1 year to the next, for one generation to the next, potentially. And we want to find these values. So the new n of 0, so the newborns, the 1-year-olds that survive, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and those that survive to 4 years. And we have our current values for time t. So that's just the current time, what the population is right now. And we know what the current newborns are, 1, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. We know what the fecundity values are, and we know what the survival rates are. So what we can do is we can do a lot of math, as you can see, is we're going to take this value, so n of 0 is going to be multiplied by this value, so b of 0, and that's what this is right here, n of 0, b of 0, n of 1, b of 1, n of 2, b of 3, n of, sorry, no, I messed that up. It's 2 and 2, 3 and 3, and 4 and 4. The numbers do match, but it's you go over and down, and you do it for every value. But you'll notice, like when you have n of 1 times 0, it's going to be 0. N of 2 times 0 is going to be 0. So all the values that have zeros are going to, there's going to be a lot of zeros, so we can ignore a lot of the values. And ultimately what we want to get is we're going to get all the values from the top column, and then we're only going to get one value as we go across, because there's one value in this row, and then it's all zeros, one value in this row, these three, and then it's all zeros. So that's why you get 4 values at the for the top row, because you have your 1, 2, 3, your 5 values, sorry. You have your 0 through 4, and then you only have one value for S. And then you can solve for it by adding these together, and then your new n of 0 is going to be 160. Your new n of 1 is going to be 50 times 0.5, 25, and that's where these values come from. So that's kind of a quick walkthrough of it. And I do like how their activities kind of set up, but I'm going to show you how, for the second activity, not this first one, I'll show you how I go through how I go about it. There's kind of 2 ways you can go about it. For this first one, again, this is a quick reminder. So what values go across the top? We have 2 columns essentially that we can pick from. These our S of X values or B of X values across the top?
B of X.
Yeah, right. So it's just, we just pull the B of X values. This is how we would fill in the first part of the matrix table. So it's just a quick refresher. Pretty simple. And these will be given to us. Just so we can be sure we did that right. Submit it. Okay. Okay, so now this is more of like the level that you would potentially see on the exam, where you're given a matrix table, you're given these values, you have to know that these are our B of X fecundity values, we have to know that these are S of X survival rate values, and then they're going to tell us like the number of individuals at each age at time t equals this. So these values here, we would plug in over here, and we're going to ultimately solve for these values over here. But in order to do that, so when it starts the first question, how many 3-year-olds would you expect in the population at time t plus 1? So we need to solve for that. But what I like to do is I'll show you my notes. Sorry, let me check the chat real quick. Okay, good. Yeah, so yeah, you will be responsible for calculating this because we have an activity and an example. So, it shows us a couple of ways how to do this. But what I like to do is I like to set it up a little differently, right? So this is the information that we're given. And the first step I like to do is like to fill in the matrix table, right? So we can fill in this column over here. And then the next thing that I actually like to do is I like to go back to life tables. So now if you're good at math and you can visualize this in your head pretty easily, you can do the math just by using this table right here and plugging numbers and adding them together if necessary and answer the questions. But for me, I'm more of a visual person. So I like to set it back up in a life table, and then you can draw from what you fill in that life table to answer the questions in this activity. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll make a life table where I plug it in, right? So we're given age categories and we're given numbers for that. So we can fill those in, we can add it together, and we know that our initial population was 304, and we know how many of each individual, or how many of individuals we have at each age category. With each age category, we're given a fecundity value, so we can just fill those in. And we're also given survival rates. We can fill those in. But if we look at the questions, they're going to ask us how many, maybe newborns, or how many individuals in the next age are we going to see? And that's going to depend on how many individuals are born by each age category, as well as how many of each age category survive. So I make these two columns, and I put zeros in right here because the fecundity is 0. So newborns from the current year, they're not going to make any new babies. 1-year-olds, it's a 0, so they're also not going to make any new babies. But so we can calculate based on the fecundity and the population size, or the number of individuals. So B of X, N of X is how we're going to calculate the new babies, right? So we can fill that in for each age class. 0, 0, we already said this is mathematically how we get it. But for 2-year-olds, there's 35 of them, and they have a fecundity or birth rate of 0.2. So 35 times 0.2 is 7. 3-year-olds, 26 of them times 0.4 is 10.4, and so on. So we can calculate for each age bracket how many offspring they're going to have, and we get a total of 39.6, but we can't have partial individuals, right? So we could round it to whole numbers. We're going to get a total of 40 new offspring from this original time t from that population. We can do the same thing for survival. We can use the n of 0 times n of x times s of x. So we have the number of individuals and their survival rate for each age category. And we can say we have originally we had 122 newborns. They had a survival rate of 0.946. So out of the 122, 115 survive. And same thing here. We have N1 times B1. So out of the 101 1-year-olds, 0.98 or 98.5% survived. So out of the 101, we end up with 99 point something. And so on. We have 2-year-olds, we have 34 that survive, 3-year-olds, 25, 4-year-olds, 8, and then for the 6-year-olds, none of them survived. So nothing made it to age 7. And again, we can sum up these values, and we can say that of the original 304, 283 survived. So we know the newborns and the survival. So other than some basic arithmetic, all the values we have in this life table, we can answer the activity questions. And we can even add in more information, right? We take 304 minus 283, the original minus the survival. We can even make a statement, 21 died. So it's just the opposite of what we said, but same idea. And then I made an announcement about this, but I just want to bring it up here. This is a really good YouTube video that walks through these Leslie's matrix models as well. So it's kind of where I got some of my notes from for putting this together. And it just goes in a little bit more depth. And it's another way I would recommend checking that out. I think it's only like 10, 12 minutes or something. So it's not terribly long, but it is a good way to kind of work out a lot of where the math is happening in these matrix tables. Okay, so now
And
if we
question.
go, sure.
So since you're solving for n of x t plus 1, would that be the new would that be the survivable rate? So if you go back to like the matrix table, and we're solving for the n of x t plus 1,
Mm-hmm.
would that be the survive, like the how many of them have survived, and then like individually? So like you would have 100 for n of 1, and then for babies you would have 40 for n of 0.
It's gonna be the combination of those that survived and those that were born into that age bracket.
Okay.
Okay, and from the chat it asks, are we limited to one scratch piece of paper on the exam, or can we use a whiteboard? You're definitely not limited to one piece of scratch paper. As long as you, and I don't think it's a bad idea, if you have a handheld whiteboard, I think that would be fine to use. You just show that it's blank at the beginning of the exam and you can use a handheld whiteboard. Or if you have a whiteboard that's visible on the wall, you can also use one of those as long as the computer can see that it was blank. And the only problem with one on the wall, I don't want to diverge too far here, is if you have to leave the camera to use it, then you cannot use it. You have to remain in, view of the camera the whole time. Does that make sense? Yeah, as long as you writing on the board can remain in view of the camera, I don't have a problem using a whiteboard. I can, some people like to do that, that works. Okay, now let's go back to the activity. So now we have all of our information. We can go back and answer the individual questions. So now it's asking us for number 1, how many 3-year-olds would you expect in the population at time t? So how could we reword this? Like, how could we say this a different way?
You would say how many 2-year-olds survive to age 3?
Exactly. So how many 2-year-olds from the original population survived? So yes, like you said, you could, to answer this question, you could use the values in the matrix, the 35, the N2 times the 0.985, the S2, and get a value of 34. And that's completely acceptable, right? If you can do that, on paper and your brain can see that in the matrix table, that's the purpose of the tables. My brain has a hard time recalling what the values all mean in the matrix table and how to plug them in. So I like to convert it back to a life table, but either method, is correct, or both methods are correct, and you can use either one that you're comfortable with. I just wanted to show an alternative way, because what I would do is say how many 2-year-olds survived, or how many would you expect? You could scroll back up to this life table and look at your 2-year-olds. Right, and this is our value here. So this is their survival. So the 2-year-olds that survived, 34.4, or rounded to a whole number of 34. Okay, so how many newborns or 0-year-olds would you expect in the population T plus 1? So another way to say this is how many new babies into the next year would we expect? And again, you can calculate that. It's the sum of the new babies from each age class, right? So you can calculate the individual numbers from the matrix, but you can also use the life table. And this is, each one of these values can be calculated from the matrix and then add them together. That's where we get our 40. That's how many newborns we're going to have in time t plus 1. Okay, and then question 3 says, how many of the newborns expected at time t plus 1 would be produced by individuals that are 3 years old at time t?
10. 10.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
correct. 10 is the answer. Yeah. So how many new babies were made by the original 3-year-olds? It's kind of maybe another way we could word it. And that's our population, or well, I guess our population of 3-year-olds, so N3, and then their fecundity value of B3. So that's 26 times 0.4, 10.4 rounded. So the whole number of 10 offspring. Exactly, correct. All right, yeah, and then that's how I kind of walked through getting to these questions. And again, I mentioned you can do it if you can just visualize this. It's quicker to do that potentially, but if you need a second way to do it, you can convert it back to a life table like that. Okay. Any questions on how this activity or how we do the calculations from the life table or where the numbers came from? Does that seem to make sense? How we put the life table together and where the numbers are coming from and what we're multiplying together to get.
Yeah, this was helpful. I think from the last, I think going over T11, we did a lot of life table. So it was like being able to transfer this back into a life table makes a lot more sense.
Okay, cool. And that's good to see the connection of why these units are together. Okay, and then someone from the chat liked it in the life table as well. Good. So at least we know there's multiple ways to approach it. And again, whatever you feel comfortable with for the exam, awesome. Okay, so then the next section, this is a series of videos that kind of talk about human population. We won't watch those. There's a couple true false questions that they ask in there that they give answers to. Were there any questions from the videos that anybody had offhand or?
Are we going to be using the rule of 70 to on the exam? Or I guess, I mean, I don't know if you can say it yes or no, but in order to determine the increase of population, like the doubling of the population, like if any of the math that he uses on the videos, like is that something that we're gonna have to know in detail? Like, yeah.
No, I think no, theoretically what the rule of 70 is saying, like, but you won't have to, there won't be like an actual calculation with the rule of 70.
Okay. I know, like, I think the first chapter in this section talks a lot about like just like what is that? The graph of like populations in different countries. And then he goes over that again. So just is it like good to be like, we know that if if it's an upside down pyramid, then the population is decreasing. If it's a pyramid, then it's increasing. And if it's relatively rectangular, it'll be stable. Like that's something that we should be
Yeah,
aware of,
that
like, how to
information's overlapping and be able
Yeah.
to describe that. If you see one of those images, you might get a multiple choice.
Okay.
What is happening with this population? Increasing, decreasing, staying the same, or none of the above, or something like that.
Okay.
That'd be a good multiple choice question.
And then like his demographic transition, like this, like pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, and post-transitional, is that like should we know more so like where the values would fall? Like would we would have to know like in the industrial, then the population would be increasing because the birth or relatively stabilizing because the birth rate is decreasing. In the transitional, the birth rate is increasing, and like is that something that we're gonna look at or need
Not in that much detail that you just described. You
Okay.
might be asked like what's a possible reason that human population is not following the logistic model like we talked about, and that has to do with the industrial revolution and technology and medicine and those kind of, think more on the biological side. You won't have to know like the curve turned at this year at this number or anything that in depth. So no, but definitely good questions.
All right, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions from T12? All right, and obviously if anybody watching this later has some, feel free to send me messages and let me know what your questions are. But if not, we'll go ahead and we can move on to T13. So this one, as you can probably tell too, if you've gone through it already, is building on a lot of the information that we've already talked about. So in previous chapters, we've talked about fragmentation, right? We know that fragmentation is essentially just a solid piece of land or one connected piece of land that was broken up into multiple smaller, different pieces of land. And some of the problems with that is, we lose total area of land. So it deteriorates the amount of habitat or decreases the amount of habitat. It often these patches are, sometimes they're connected through corridors, sometimes they're not. And sometimes that matrix, they talk about in a little more detail here. So that's the matrix is the piece of land in between. So essentially it's the corridor, or it's, it's not have to be the corridor, I should say. A corridor is more man-made or natural structure, something like we had the example where bridges go over the highway. So part of the matrix could be in between patches on the highway. It could be the highway itself as part of the matrix, and part of the corridor is another part of the matrix. And the quality between those two parts of the matrix are different, as well as the quality of patches, as we see in this chapter, can be different, and generally are. So the example that they used here, I think, is kind of like a wetlands, right? So if we want to think in terms of patches, these are the ponds, right? So they're different sizes. There's different distance between certain ponds and others. The matrix, so in between. So this looks a little more green. This looks a little more brown. So, maybe one theoretical example is salamanders trying to move between the ponds, right? If there's not a lot of land, they could probably go from here across this greener, maybe more moist habitat and get to this pond easier. But if they have to go across this drier, larger matrix, they might not be able to make the trek and might dry out or get picked off by a predator more easily when they're going through this matrix. So the other pond. And then at the bottom here, they talk about 3 types of models, metapopulation models. So the first one, right, they call it just the basic metapopulation model. And the major assumption of this is that all the habitat patches are equal in quality and that the habitat matrix between the patches are inhospitable. And we know that, offhand, what we just discussed, that's generally not true, right? The patches can be similar in quality, but they're not going to be identical in quality because a lot of them are, they're just different sizes, different shapes, contain different resources, different predators potentially. And then it mentions that the habitat matrix is inhospitable. And by inhospitable, does that mean that the organisms can't go through it, like it's lava or something, that it would kill them?
No, they can go through it. It makes it more difficult, and so the journey then becomes whether it just becomes more difficult. They can go through it, but whether they make it or not is a whole different question.
Yeah, essentially think about it. It's a place in between. It's where they would not live because it doesn't fulfill necessarily their fundamental or realized niche, right? So they, like you said, they can pass through it, but depending on the quality of the matrix, some might be more challenging to pass through than others. Okay, and then the second model, that's the source sink metapopulation model. How is that different than the basic metapopulation model?
The basic metapopulation model assumes that all of the fragmented habitats are equally sustainable or within the ecological niche of each subpopulation, which isn't true. Like some ponds might be a lot more resource heavy than other ponds. And so the basic model assumes all are equal, and then the more complex model assumes takes that into consideration.
Yeah, so the source sink, it just assumes that habitat patches differ in quality, right? The basic habitat patches are all equal in quality. So the source sink, that's already gets a little more complex, but it's also therefore a little more realistic. What do we mean by sources and sink patches? How would we describe a source patch? So is that where birth rates are high or birth rates are kind of low?
They produce high numbers, so there's a high birth rate in source patches.
Mm-hmm. And then do organisms typically stay in the source patches indefinitely, or can they leave the source patches, or?
They can disperse. There's nothing stopping them from dispersing other than traveling through the matrix.
In fact, most times they generally pass their carrying capacity, but so they don't have a mass extinction there, a lot of the organisms in source patches will leave there, they'll migrate away, and they'll go to these other sink patches, which are kind of generally lower quality patches. They might be smaller, might not have all the resources needed. The organisms can live there, but if they only a local population was isolated there, they wouldn't be able to reproduce at high enough numbers, and that would probably lead to an extinction. But the reason those sink patches persist is you get the overflow essentially from the source patch through the migration, emigration into the sink patch and replenish those numbers, and they can kind of maintain a stable population as long as they're getting organisms from the source patches coming in pretty regularly. Okay, and then the last model that they talk about is the landscape metapopulation model. So they describe it as being the most realistic model because it acknowledges that both the patches and the habitat matrix can vary in quality, which I think, if we've been outside a few times, we can attest that that's generally true. Okay, and then they get into modeling metapopulation dynamics. And I'll say right off the bat, there's no example here really with numbers, there's no activities, so you won't be responsible for knowing this model on the mathematical side. You won't have to do any calculations with it, but you might get asked a question of what is this model telling us, or what can we get out of this model, so know it in a biological conceptual context. So what is P? What is the model predicting?
Here's the fraction of habitat patches that are occupied. So how many, what is it like fraction of how many of the patches are lived by with that species?
Yeah, so can you,
yeah.
Go, do you have more? Sorry.
No, I was saying that's a really complex way to put it. So if you have a simpler way, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, so they just describe it as some fraction of occupied habitats, right? And then the E and the C, that's essentially going to be our extinction and colonization values. So if we have no extinction, that all of the habitats are colonized, we're going to have 1 minus 0, and it's just going to be 1. So the probability or the fraction is going to be a whole 100%. But we know that sometimes we have extinctions and we have different rates of colonization. So if the extinctions exceed colonization, then it can drop, it can drop essentially to 0, and it could say that this can't be occupied by organisms. So typically it'll range from a value of 1 to 0, with 1 being the highest, 100%, and 0 obviously being that it's nothing's occupied. And then they kind of, in the next section, give us a little bit of kind of an example about this, where we have these butterflies. And what they did is they observed them for 9 years, and they found they were on a series of different islands that had, I think, was 1,600 meadows on the islands, and that were suitable essentially in their fundamental niche. But they found that only 12 to 39% of these patches were occupied in any given year over that 9-year period. So they asked, well, why is this? And what they're finding is that the rates of colonization and the rates of extinction are changing from year to year, but it's staying high enough. Colonization is replenishing extinction that it keeps the population from going completely extinct. It's able to colonize certain regions of its habitat over different times of year. And if we think a little bit maybe beyond what Cogbooks even described, why might it change location from year to year where these butterflies are colonizing? Why isn't it always the same islands that they're colonizing, or the same meadows that they're colonizing?
Because there's abiotic factors that contribute to like resource density within the different islands. And so like some islands one year might have a lot more food, or some islands might be heavier with predators than others. And so they're not going back there.
Yeah, I think those are great examples, right? There could be a number of different reasons. Abiotic could be related to weather conditions. There might be drought for some reason on one island one year, so it doesn't grow flowers and they don't have their food. So it's all kind of connected. And predators, there could be, a little bacterial outbreak or a virus outbreak on one island or one meadow that kind of kills off that population. There could be a fire in one of the meadows, so it burns all the eggs and there's no reproduction. So that population completely collapses, they die, plus there's nothing to recolonize for a year or two. So yeah, there could be a number of reasons why they're not continue or consistently at the same meadows. Okay, and then this is another example, pretty straightforward. So it just kind of shows what we have here is this owl out in California. It has all these different habitat patches that they find it in, and they find different numbers of individuals in those patches. And there tends to be a really strong correlation of the size of the patch with the number of individuals. And we can see that pretty visually, like these are kind of medium-sized patches. So you get 100 individuals up here, 60 here. Here's a really small patch. We only have 6 individuals. The bigger patches down here have 190 and 266. And we can kind of think back, it says a little bit in the text here, but thinking back to our previous concepts, why do we generally see more individuals in larger patches?
I'm sorry, you said larger individuals in larger patches?
If I did, I misspoke. Good catch. Why do we see more individuals in larger patches?
Okay, yeah. So because larger patches have more resources for more individuals. It has a higher carrying capacity than smaller patches.
Sure, right? There's more resources, as you said, in part because there's more space. So there's more nesting opportunities for these owls they're not competing for those, a few big trees necessarily with cavities maybe. Yeah. And then what about like the source populations? Why do they tend to be kind of even more, larger around the source populations than the sink populations? Why do they tend to be larger when they're in closer proximity to that source population?
So what do you mean by larger? Like who's larger? The owls are larger or the population?
Sorry, yeah, I should clarify that. That's fair. They made a comment about distance, right? That if you have a source population, the population sizes, so the number of owls is going to be larger, closer to that source population than it is sometimes further out from that source population. And why is that?
Yeah, because because the source, sorry, because the source population is able to, one has a higher carrying, it doesn't have a higher carrying capacity. There's more individuals being reproduced within that sink, within that source population, and then they have to eventually migrate out into the sink populations. But that's why the larger, because the offspring are being born in that area.
That's correct. And I don't think I worded my question still as intended, but it's more, we go back to like the distance of the islands, remember from the principle of island biogeography. So it also says in the text that the population patches that are closer in proximity to the source population tend to have more individuals than the patches that are further away from the source population. And that's a simple answer of they're just closer, so the owls are going to find them first, fill those up, and then once those get filled, then they got to move again and kind of migrate out. So they're not going to want, it's an energetic efficiency problem, right? They don't want to go any further away than they have to because that costs energy. They're trading time of reproduction when they're looking for a home. So they want to stay close to that source population as they kind of can and not have to travel really far away. That make sense?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the big small islands and the close and far islands. So same idea here, just in a little bit more detail with an explicit example of owls here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you.
No problem. All right, yeah, and this unit here, this was relatively short compared to the other ones. So I don't have any major things that I want to talk about anymore with T13. Is there anything that anybody in the group here has questions or wants to go over again, or?
When thinking, okay, so I have questions about a couple of things. Like when we're looking at the applications within any of the chapters, so whether it's the butterflies or whether it's like saving black-footed ferrets or whether it's, I think earlier in the exams, there was like a conservation of like the Florida panther. How, I know that some of those questions have shown up on Cogbooks, and a lot of them have been like a direct, like, what did these people do? Or how did these people, how in depth should we go into these application chapter? Because I find it difficult to like remember these application chapters, although like I know the bigger concept, but when it comes like it's specific, it's just a lot more difficult. So like yeah, what's your suggestion on like how we should approach these like applications within for like in context of the exam?
Okay, no, well, first, I appreciate the feedback for sure, and noting that the details can be difficult to remember, because I agree, sometimes you might get, 4 or 5 examples, and here, we might have 10, 15 examples through cogbooks. So I would say minimum, definitely understand the big picture. Like if somebody if it's brought up in the exam, the black-footed ferret, conceptually, like what were they looking for, and what is the application that was in this unit from like the main. So it's an evidence of metapopulations and the rescue effect of how they were able to use population cycles to save the black-footed ferret. So that's kind of in a nutshell what the application was here. Shouldn't have to, I mean, you won't have to know any details as far as like any numbers, or like 125 to 150, like that's way too detailed, so that's not important. So I would start big picture and kind of work down from there into maybe briefly what they did, like what method did they use. The name application is in the title here, so what was the application actually? Does that help at all, or?
Yeah, yeah.
But I do appreciate that, and with the exams, we try not to be too detailed with some of the examples, and that's why, if you remember the previous exam where we like with the monkey flowers, there was a lot of text on the exam to help remind everybody what that experiment was, so you wouldn't have to recall all those details. So let's try to find a balance of how much text to put on the exam, because we also don't want to make have you 10 minutes reading, this whole section for the exam again itself. So we kind of take out what's important and then ask questions based on that.
Okay, cool. And then this is separate from the exam or cogbooks, but in the black-footed ferret example, I found like they were constantly like these ecologists were constantly like, well, we think they're extinct. And then they're like, well, actually, we found them. And they're like, well, actually, they're extinct. Well, actually, we found them. Is that something that happens within like when we're looking at larger species? So like sometimes they're like, this population is in the extinct, category, or in the endangered category. But because as humans, we can't know how many like actual species there are based on observation, right? Like we can't go into the Amazon and look at every single animal. Is that just a common thing that happens in ecology where like, yeah, species just
Yeah.
reappear?
Yes.
Or
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of surprising, because you'll hear, headlines like somebody caught, 2,000-year-old extinct fish off of the coast of Florida or something, thought to be extinct for thousands of years. And that just comes down to quality of methods, funds available. I mean, you might have the highest quality method to survey somewhere, but if you only have one boat surveying the entire coast of Florida alone, yet alone the ocean, is going to be impossible. But if you've got, millions of dollars to survey, with hundreds or thousands of boats and stuff, you're going to have a lot more accurate information. So yeah, I mean, I've said it before, ecology, a good way to describe it is it's messy. We kind of work with living documents. Populations fluctuate, that's a big theme that we just talked about. So when they go up, you can take them off, some of them take them off the Endangered Species Act. When they go down, they get put back on. So I'm sure, wolves have been on and off. Before, they've used hunting when they go too high to regulate them, put them on endangered species. When they're too low in certain areas, no hunting, and have huge fines. And the idea is to kind of find the predictors of what these population cycles are. So like, why are they fluctuating, and how can we kind of dampen the oscillations to keep them at a carrying capacity that's manageable for humans? So, and some of that's subjective, right? Because, people like wolves because they're natural, they're good predators, they keep disease down in deer. They keep deer and elk from eating crops a lot of times because they keep them more in the forest than open areas. But, ranchers have problems with them because they do come in, they kill their dogs, they kill their livestock. Like they're, they're in competition, if not a threat, to humans. So there's that socioeconomic kind of aspect of, are we we're playing, livestock managers, so we want to keep them at this population for certain reasons, and sometimes it's difficult to do that, even with a bunch of, applied methods.
Okay, cool. I really like ecology. I think it's really cool.
Mhm.
And
No, I think,
yeah.
there's so many questions that are, open-ended yet, like, people have made these models, and obviously, as we keep saying, we go to more complex, there's a saying that no model is correct, but some models are useful. And we can think of it as, models are a form of a hypothesis too, right? Where it's the best predictor that we currently have, it's the best explanation for a given phenomena that we have, but we always are open to wanting to improve these models. If we find there's a better predictor, we thought maybe temperature was the big driver for this migration pattern, but it turns out it's the barometric pressure interacting with temperature. That's a really cool finding. It builds on previous knowledge, and it's, it's very rarely like solved in absolutes.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, no problem. Appreciate the discussion. Any other questions? This could be related to the class or the upcoming exam kind of too, if we want. I still do need to add the points onto the exam too, right? Yeah, because we're coming up on exam 3. Yeah, so the points, there's those 6 points back that will be added to everybody's exam 2 yet. So late announcement, I suppose, in here. Okay, but if not, if the group here is satisfied, we can call it a session. And obviously, if anybody that watches this later has questions we didn't get to, send me a message. So appreciate the group's participation today, and I will go ahead and end the session and post this video shortly.
No, I have a question, but if you can end the recording, that would be.
Sure, I can. I think I could. Yeah.